Hi, this is Sarit Switzer, and welcome to the It Is Taught podcast, a podcast devoted to the teachings of Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi as recorded in his most famous work, the Tanya. My hope for this show is to make these teachings accessible and relatable to the average person, regardless of prior Jewish education or affiliation. The episodes follow the prescribed daily study portions and are meant to serve as practical lessons in how to live your life as your true self and develop an authentic and powerful relationship with your Creator. I have personally experienced the effects the study of this work has had on me, and I'm excited to share what I can of this knowledge with you. So please join me on this journey of learning, self-growth, and connection with your source. Hi, and welcome to the It Is Taught podcast. This is episode 219 for the 30th of Sivan in a leap year. So first of all, happy Rosh Chodesh. This is the first of 2 days of Rosh Chodesh Tammuz. Secondly, I'd like to announce that today's episode has been generously sponsored by my mother and my stepfather, Chaya Miriam and Joel Torag, in honor of, or for the Aliyas Neshama of Sarah Friedel Bas Avraham Elia Shalom, who was my maternal grandmother, who actually also happened to be the wife of my maternal grandfather, who this entire episode series, this entire podcast is dedicated in loving memory of. So hopefully this will be a really special episode today. So thank you so much to my mother and my stepfather for generously sponsoring this episode. And as mentioned a couple of episodes ago, I'm now accepting sponsorships for these episodes in general. So you can reach out to me for details on that. You can reach out at itistaught@gmail.com. So with all of those preliminary introductions in place, so let's begin with today's episode. So today's episode is really interesting. We're actually going to be doing a full chapter. It's chapter 8 of Sha'ar, HaYichud, VeHaemuna. And I'm going to start off talking about a book that I read a little while ago. I think I might have mentioned this book previously on a previous episode, but I'll mention it again. And the name of the book was Against Empathy by Paul Bloom. So the title itself might sound really controversial. Like everybody loves empathy, right? Empathy is like all the rage, especially these days. Politicians even talk about trying to be more empathetic and all of that. And the author really makes the argument against empathy. And he talks about really the downfalls of empathy. He doesn't, to be clear, he doesn't say that there's no place for empathy at all. But he does talk a lot about, and he gives a lot of really compelling arguments to suggest that empathy is definitely not the be-all end-all, and how sometimes empathy can really bring a person into, it can serve as a stumbling block to actually doing good. So this came to mind for me in reading today's entry and preparing for the podcast today, because really, to me, the biggest downfall of empathy and where empathy can really mess us up is that ultimately, while we think that empathy is a very selfless kind of thing, it actually is very self-oriented, because the idea, people always say the difference between sympathy and empathy is that sympathy is where you really feel for another person, but you can't really put yourself in their shoes. And so it's like you just kind of like feel bad for them in this kind of like removed way, versus empathy is that you really try to empathize with the person, you really try to feel what it is that they're feeling, and then you really find that feeling within yourself, and you find a way that you could relate to whatever it is that the person's going through. So really, ultimately, while this might seem like a really nice thing, and I'm not saying that there's not a place for empathy, basically at its like core, empathy is actually very self-oriented, because we're relating things to our own personal experiences. So it's like if somebody tells us that they're going through a hard time, we relate to the facts of like, okay, when was the last time I went through a difficult time? Maybe somebody lost their job. We think, okay, did I ever lose my job, or did I ever go through something similar like that I could relate to? So the thing is, though, ultimately, our experiences, as much as we can try to relate to other people, are not other people's experiences. And it's not the same thing. And what we'll learn about today, and really the focus of today's episode, is how much more so this is the case when it comes to God, and how there's this natural human tendency to really see everything through our own perspectives, to be very geocentric in that way, whether we're talking about humanity as a whole or whether we're talking about our own personal experiences. I mean, it makes sense because this is really all we have that we're able to relate to. But and especially like when we look at the ways that we describe God, when we look at in references to God in the Bible and in prayer and things like that, there seems to be a lot of anthropomorphic descriptions of God. We talk about God being kind. We talk about God being wise. We talk about God being severe, angry, even, like all these things that really do seem to be very human in their traits. And so it's only natural for us to see God in these terms. And various rabbinical sources actually do talk about this, and they talk about the fact that one of the reasons why God is presented to us in these kind of terms is in order to make it relatable to us. Like we talk about God's hand, we talk about God's face, God's fingers, like all of these things that we think of in human terms. And the part of the explanation for this is because it does make it more relatable to us, and it gives us something to kind of grasp onto. But Chassidus takes this whole idea to a much deeper place. And what we learn, and we've spoken, I think, about this a little bit previously, is that when we talk about God in anthropomorphic terms, we kind of have to reverse it on its head. And we have to come to realize and recognize that when we talk about God's hand, it's not that we have a hand and then we look to God and we see God's hand and that's a reflection of God's hand, and that's a way for us to understand God's hand. That's one way of looking at it, but a much deeper way to look at it is to recognize the fact that God's hand is the ultimate hand. God's hand is the essence of handness. God's chesed, God's kindness, God's giving is the essence of giving. And what we experience as a hand down here, what we experience as giving down here, what we experience as wisdom down here is merely a very imperfect and poor reflection of God's traits in these ways. And so this is the subject of today's episode. This is the subject of how it is that God's traits, when we talk about God's traits and God's various characteristics, there's a reason for it, and there's a reason why we do it, but they're very different than human characteristics. And we shouldn't make the mistake that God's characteristics are like human characteristics. And the biggest defining difference between the two things, between God's characteristics and human characteristics, is that when it comes to a human being, when it comes to us, the various characteristics that we have are composites of who we are. They're compartmentalized in a certain sense. Like even if, yes, there's one me that experiences all these feelings and emotions, on the other hand, I can at the same time break it down. I can say sometimes I'm giving, sometimes I'm more harsh, sometimes I'm happy, sometimes I'm sad. I like chocolate. I also like green vegetables. Like there's all these different things, and each one of these things are somewhat fragmented in a certain way. Like, again, not to say that there's not this like holistic aspect of them where they all do come together and make up who I am, but each one of them can be broken down into their various parts. Well, this is not the same with God, as we'll see, is that with God's character traits, all of it is really just, it's unified in a different kind of way. There's no separation. There's no like part of God that's separate from him. Like there's no like God's will and then God. The way that we have like there's Sarid and then there's my will for chocolate. I like chocolate, and that's kind of like two separate things. With God, there is no separation like that. And it's difficult to talk about this because, again, this is one of those things that as much as we can discuss it, we can't really relate to it because it's not the way we operate. It is a very fundamental different way than the way God is versus us. And so thus it's something that's really beyond our comprehension. So it's something we kind of have to just like kind of learn about and think about, but we'll never fully grasp. And the particular character trait that the Alter Rebbe is going to focus on really in the second half of the section of today's portion, is on the very first character trait within man, the very first attribute that is manifest within us, which is the attribute of chokhmah, the attribute of wisdom. And we know that wisdom plays a very important role in Judaism in general, in Hasidus in particular, where we talk about how like really everything originates from wisdom. Even when it comes to God, we say that God creates the world through wisdom. We say Reshit Chokhmah, like wisdom is the start of everything. But we'll come to see through learning today and also tomorrow's episode will be a continuation of that, of how wisdom for us and wisdom for God are two very, very different things. And how when it comes to us, when we talk about human wisdom, then we see that human wisdom births a bunch of different types of other types of character traits in a very progressive kind of matter. And it's in this kind of like descending order that's very specific to the level that's below it and very measured, so that it's like sort of like in accordance with the amount of wisdom that a person has, this is going to lead to the level of emotions that they had, to how sophisticated a person is. So it's like you look at different people in the world, and people who tend to be, maybe it's not so politically correct to say, but people who have a little bit more of a sophisticated education tend to be a little bit more refined as people, right? And people who kind of like are illiterate and like never really got a proper education, and or maybe just don't have that natural, like they never really had the ability to use their intellects properly, they're not necessarily going to be as refined. They might have other traits, don't get me wrong, but there is some kind of relationship that's happening between like the level of a person's wisdom and the level of a person's character traits, like the level of their refinement as human beings. Versus when it comes to God, and this is more the subject of tomorrow's episode, this isn't the case at all. And there's no division, there's no progression in that way. And it's more that we'll see that God's chokhmah, God's wisdom, is actually totally, it permeates everything, and it permeates everything down to the lowest degree of who he is. So I think it's a good time now to start and get straight into the text. And I think the Alter Rebbe hopefully will explain this a little bit better than I can. And maybe we can bring it all together at the end. So here we go. So again, we are in chapter 8 of Sha'ar VeHaemuna. And the Alter Rebbe begins, and he says that what the Alter Rebbe wrote, the Alter Rebbe of blessed memory, he wrote that God, his being and his essence and his das, his knowledge, are all one. So, right. So we talked about this previously, how God and his knowledge are one and the same. God's knowledge is intrinsic to him, as opposed to, for us, our knowledge is supplemental to who we are. So the Rambam taught us that this unity of all of these things, God's being, essence, and his knowledge, are unified in a simple unity that is not composite at all. So not only is this the case in terms of God's das, which is that what she talks about, how we talks about how God's knowledge is intrinsic to who he is. It's not supplemental to him, the way that it is for human beings. Like there's Sarid, and then there's what I know, and I'm constantly gaining knowledge through my life. So the Alter Rebbe goes on, and he says that this is not true only for God's knowledge, but this is actually true of all of the attributes of God and all of his holy names and all of the different terms that the prophets and that Chazal, the sages, gave to God, whether we talk about God as being Chanun or Rachum or Chassid and things like that. So Chanun is gracious, Rachum is merciful, Chassid is beneficent, and so forth. And also we call God sometimes Chacham, the wise one, as it says. And this is a citation from Yeshayahu chapter 31, verse 2, where it says, V'gam hu chacham v'gomer, meaning, and he is also wise. So we ascribe wisdom to God as well. And so to God's will, because we talk about how God wants different things. We talk about how God desires those who fear him. We talk about how God desires to do good, like chafetz chesed, and that he wants the Rashaim to do tshuva, the evil people to repent. Like he doesn't want the wicked people to die, but rather he wants them to do tshuva. And then the Alter Rebbe brings a citation for this here from Habakkuk chapter 1, verse 13, where it says, Tahor enai merot bara, where it says, your eyes are too pure to behold evil. So that's an allusion to something that actually God doesn't want. Doesn't want he who is pure of eyes to see evil. And then, but when we talk about all these traits of God, so when we talk about God's will, when we talk about God's wisdom, when we talk about God's chesed and rahmanas, his compassion, and all the different attributes that we give to God, they don't add anything to God, God forbid. It's not a composite into who he is, but rather his being and essence and his will and wisdom and his understanding and knowledge and his chesed and his gevura, his kindness and his restraint and his compassion and his beauty, which the beauty is made up of the combination of the chesed and the gevura, the kindness and the severity. And so too, all of the different attributes of God, these holy attributes, it's all one simple unity, one truly simple unity, which is God's being and essence, really, as the Rambam of blessed memory said. And so this is something like, basically, this is really in contrast to us. I just want to really emphasize that it's like, and the Alter is going to get into it more. So again, so just like I spoke about a little bit in the introduction, and also in a previous episode where we talked about the supplemental knowledge of human knowledge, that when we talk about like what we know, we talk about, like I talk about Sarid. What do I know? I know a lot of different things, right? But I'm constantly learning new things. So I'm constantly adding to my knowledge. And so, which shows that the knowledge is not really intrinsic to who I am. This is true for all human character traits, that even though I might be a kind person by nature, I can become more kind. I can do more kind things. I can develop further kindness. I can develop more of a sense of compassion towards people, right? Like there's different traits that we can develop, which shows that the fact that we can develop these traits shows that they're external to who we are. They're not essentially who we are, even though, yes, there's a connection with them and us, obviously, and they're found within us, but they're not essential to us in the way that these traits are essential to God. Like God does not ever become wiser or kinder or more knowledgeable. Like all wisdom, all knowledge, all kindness are all found within him in an essential way. So now the Alter is going to continue with us, and he's going to talk about how it is that this is not something that any human can understand at all. It's not, the way that he explains this poetically is he says that this isn't something that any mouth can speak and any ear can hear. And it is not in the heart of any man to recognize it clearly, because a person illustrates in their mind all kinds of different concepts that they want to conceptualize and understand as they exist within him. So for example, let's say if somebody wants to visualize in their own minds the idea of will, like what is will? What is the essence of will? Or what is the essence of wisdom? Or what is the essence of understanding, of bina or das, of knowledge and all these things? Or the essence of chesed or rachamim, or any type of attribute. Like if we try to illustrate these concepts in our minds, we do it in a way that is related to us. So like, for example, like if I'm going to think about, like if I want to think to myself, what does will mean? What does it mean to want something? So obviously I'm going to think about myself, and I'm going to think about the different things that I want and how the concept of will has related to my life, how I've experienced other people wanting things, myself wanting things like that. So it's very self-referential and thus limited to my own personal experiences, right? However, when it comes to God, it doesn't work like that, because God is very high and above all of this. We say that God's name is holy, and the word holy in Hebrew is kadosh, which connotes this idea of separation, that he's separate from all of this. Meaning that he is totally, like, to an infinite degree, to myriads and myriads upon myriads of degrees, he's totally separate from all of these different attributes that we attribute to him. At least insofar as like the way that we think of these attributes in our own human mind. So it's like when we think about the idea of will, when we think about the idea of wisdom, when we think about the idea of giving, of goodness, all these things in our mind, and we think about our perception of that and our relation to these words, it's like a joke compared to like how God relates to these words. Like if we say that God is goodness, God is kindness, all these things, we have certain associations with these words that are like so far removed from what the true essence of God's kindness is. And so now the Alter Rebbe is going to shift the focus here, and he's going to focus on one particular attribute to illustrate this point. And as mentioned in the introduction, this is going to be continued tomorrow. So today we're going to focus on the human aspect, and tomorrow we're going to talk about how different it is in terms of God. So the attribute we're going to focus on right now is the attribute of chokhmah, the attribute of wisdom. So the Alter Rebbe is going to use this attribute to really illustrate to us the limitations of human wisdom and what this looks like how human wisdom manifests and the effect that it has on the rest of who we are. So the reason why the Alter Rebbe begins, he says that he's going to focus on wisdom, on chokhmah, is because this is chokhmah is called reshit. Chokhmah is called the first one, because truly it is the beginning. It is the beginning of all, and it's the source of the vitality in all of created beings. Because it's from this chokhmah that, and from here on I'm going to call it chokhmah instead of wisdom, because the translations are not totally accurate. The English translations of these words are always a little bit lacking. So we're going to call it chokhmah. So chokhmah is the beginning. Chokhmah is the head of all of the other attributes. And indeed, we know that from chokhmah, this is drawn down, bina and das. So there's a progressive like order to things. It's not random. It's not, when we look at these different attributes, it's not like they're not sporadic. There's a progression. So you have chokhmah, and then from chokhmah comes bina, and from bina comes dat. And from the das come all the other attributes in the rational soul, in what's called the nefesh hamasakelet. For example, and the Alter Rebbe gives some examples. He says, for example, love and chesed and rachamim and all these different things like kindness and compassion, any attribute that you can think of, they originally stem from the mind. So originally from chokhmah, which trickles down into bina and then das. And then from das is like the origin of all of the emotive attributes. So we've talked about this previously in the Tanya, how Tanya is that connecting force between the mind and the emotions. And so now the Alter Rebbe is going to hone in on das now, and he says that we can actually see this in a tangible way. So he says that, like, when you look at a child, for example, who doesn't have a lot of das. So again, what is das? Das is like this idea of like really knowing something in a true and solid way. Like, you don't just know it theoretically, but you know it in a way that like seeps into you. So we know little children don't really have this so much. Like, they're just starting to become aware of their surroundings. They don't have a strong awareness of the meaning of things, the deeper meaning of things. So we see with a small child that he doesn't have a lot of das, this small child, and thus we see that often children get very angry, that right, like that they're very aggressive. So there's like the terrible twos people talk about, that you see these little kids that are going around like throwing temper tantrums and stuff like that. So why are they doing that? The Alter Rebbe is saying it's because they don't have strong das. And so thus, because their das isn't strong, their other emotive attributes aren't yet totally developed. And so also we see this in the fact that they love very small things, like they're petty, kind of like they don't that we shouldn't really like. So it's like my mother always jokes. She always makes this joke that she says whenever she buys a present for my nieces and nephews, they always like the box much better. So it's like, like you could buy, I don't know if you've ever had this experience. You buy your child or your nephew or your niece or something, like a really expensive toy, like a really expensive like car, like an electric car or like a really fancy like doll or something like that, and the kid ends up playing with the box instead of the toy itself. And so the Alter Rebbe says that this actually makes a lot of sense. This is because they don't have das, so they don't have an understanding, like a deep awareness of the meaning of things, to be able to appreciate things that you should appreciate, things that you should love, because the love is in accordance with the das. Like, everything is interrelated, so there's a connection between all of these things. And so now the Alter Rebbe goes on and he says that from these different, so now we're in the midos. So we see that we started in the brain, chokhmah bina das, then we got into the midos, the emotive attributes. And once we're in the midos, then from these midos, there's a progression as well that comes from there as well. This is where what's drawn down from there are the words and letters of thought that are in the thinking mind, the thinking soul, about those things that they love, or how to go about activating kindness or compassion or any other attribute. So it's like, okay, it's one thing to have these attributes, like to feel a sense of love or to feel a sense of kindness. And then it's another thing to think about, okay, how am I going to actualize these things? So the Alter Rebbe says, he says that really, if you think about it, it's like every single thought in the world, within that thought is contained a certain attribute, a certain emotion that leads that person to think a certain thing. So our thoughts are not random. We're not just like attacked with random thoughts from nowhere. We think in certain ways in accordance with who we are, with our personalities, with how we're feeling. There's a connection between these things. And not only that, but the feeling is the instigator. It's the vitality of the thought itself. So this is perhaps leading to another tangent that maybe I'll devote another episode to. But this is something that Jonathan Haidt talks about quite a bit. He wrote a really good book called The Righteous Mind, which I would highly recommend, which talks about this whole idea. This really points to this idea that people tend to think of themselves as rational beings. We all like to think of ourselves as making decisions out of pure rationality, that our morality comes from a rational place. And what he really shows us in the book is that this isn't true at all. And in fact, our morality is coming very much from an emotional place. And that what happens is that we feel certain things and then we rationalize those feelings, and that becomes our thoughts. So this is what the Alter Rebbe is saying here. He says that you have the mind, like you have the basic intellect, then you have that translates into emotions and different personality attributes. And this in turn translates into actual concrete thoughts. And then from these concrete thoughts, now we're going to the next level. This is drawn down into letters of speech, which is and speech comes from thought, and that the vitality of the speech is the thought itself. And then from the speech, this leads to action. For example, like let's say if we're talking about like the attribute of chesed, like we're starting with that attribute of kindness. So how does this trickle down? It trickles down first into thinking about the kindness, then into maybe like speaking about it, even to yourself is a form of speaking, even if it's kind of, planning it out or whatever. And then that leads to the actual action of giving charity or being generous and giving and that kind of thing. So for example, like the Alter Rebbe gives this example, like let's say you would have a king who would command his servants to give charity. So we see that this is the connection between the speech and the action, that it's the speech of the king that is leading to the action of his servants to give. And so too with a person, like whenever we do any kind of action, so there's a power that's infused within this action and a vitality that's infused within this action. And this vitality that's infused within the action that a person does is like nothingness. It's like naught compared to the vitality that's within the speech of a person. So the point that the Alter Rebbe is bringing out here is that just to show again this progressive level from thought to speech to action, that like if you look at when we do things here in the world, it's a lot easier to imagine a person doing something in like a mindless kind of way. Like, like think about when you wake up in the morning, you brush your teeth. Like, do you even remember brushing your teeth? Like sometimes we're just in such a haze and you walk from one room to another. Even the motion of walking, we don't think to ourselves like how put one foot in front of the other in order to walk. It's a lot of the things we do are very automated, versus when we speak, it's a lot more conscious. You need to be a lot more present when you're speaking, right? So this is showing again this progression of vitality from the different levels all the way until we get to action. And then the Alter Rebbe likens this to the mashal, to the metaphor of a body and a soul. That when we think about action as compared to speech, then it's like as if the action is the body and the speech is the soul. So that's like the comparison he makes. And then he says that we could also think about this, like when we think about now we're going up, we're starting from downwards up, that when we think about speech in comparison to thought, so we can think of the speech now as the body and the letters of thought are the soul. And then we can think about, okay, now go up. Next level is that then we have the letters of the thought, and then above that is the emotion that's vested within those letters of thought. So it's those emotions are like the soul. In this case, the emotions are giving vitality to the letters of thought. And then we go back and now we're in the emotion world, right? And then in comparison to the emotion, in comparison to the chokhmah, bina, and das, like the mind that's getting its vitality from the mind, right? We said that all the emotions, all the attributes that we have come from our minds. This is like, again, so it's like in this case the mind is the soul and the emotions are the body. So it's like this relativistic metaphor of like, what is the body, what is the soul? It keeps changing as we go higher and higher depending on what level we're looking at. And so all of this is to show us that really the source of all of it, like when we go back further and further enough, like we go from action to speech, to thought, to emotion, to mind, then the very, very first point, the top point for all created beings is this chokhmah, which is the beginning. It's the head and it's the source of all of vitality throughout the entire body. So this is where the Alter Rebbe leaves us off today. And tomorrow he's going to get into Hashem's chokhmah. And he's going to talk about how for Hashem it's totally different and show us the contrast. Because really the takeaway, so I know there was a lot there in that whole map that I just gave you, but the takeaway from it all is really to show us the limited and progressive nature of all of these things and how self-referential we are based on who we are as people, whether it's due to our experiences or whether it's due to our upbringing or whether it's due to our DNA or whatever it is. It's like any action we do, any speech we have, any thought we have, any emotion we have, or even any like intelligence that we have is really limited in its scope. Any knowledge we have, any understanding we have, it's limited and based on us, whether it's based on our DNA, whether it's based on our experiences, whether it's based on our parents and our upbringing, on all of that stuff. It's extremely limited to who we are. So when we think about God and when we think about God's attributes and we call God by these different names and we refer to him in these different ways, we shouldn't think, God forbid, like we shouldn't be so egotistical to think that God's attributes are just like our own, that it's like when we feel a sense of kindness, oh, that's like how God feels kindness. So this is going back to that against empathy point, is that really, well, yes, empathy is a good thing. Sometimes, there are times when it can be extremely limited because God's kindness is not our kindness. And what we think of as kindness is not, it's not God's kindness. God's kindness is way, way greater than that, to an infinite degree. When we think of wisdom, our conception of wisdom is not God's wisdom. We have a very limited understanding of what wisdom is. Like, just like, I guess a good way that you can think about this is like, if you go back to that example of the little kid that you give the present to. So for the kid, if you buy them an expensive $100 toy, let's say, to the kid, the box is more valuable, but we see it from the outside and we're much higher and we're like, that box is like costs like 2 cents. And really the valuable thing is the toy. Like the child, if we just go based on the child's logic and the child's understanding of the world, we see how limited that is and how silly it is in comparison to what we really see, what we really know, due to our much more developed understanding and knowledge of the world. And so when it comes to God in comparison to us, it's like an even crazier comparison. Like, it does not even, us to the child is like nothing in comparison to us versus God. So that's it for today. And tomorrow we will continue along these lines when we get into what is Hashem's Chokhmah in that case. So how can we relate to it and what does it mean? So stay tuned for that and I will speak to you then. Thanks for listening to the It Is Taught podcast, hosted by Sarit Switzer. This podcast is dedicated in loving memory of my maternal grandfather, Avraham Yitzchak ben Binyamin HaKohen of blessed memory. Music by Shoshana. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to support the show, please share it with others and subscribe on YouTube, Apple iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. And make sure to leave us a 5-star review. To find out more about the It Is Taught project, including more information on my soon-to-be published book, please visit our website, itistaught.com. To catch the latest from me, follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Looking forward to speaking with you tomorrow, and until then, have a great day.